Thank you for coming here today for our 8th meeting of the Medical Marijuana Working Group. We have today with us Carmen Hansen with NCSL, that's the National Conference of State Legislators, and Jeremy Applin, who is with Focus and ASTM. The process we are going to use today is both of our presenters have prepared a presentation. We are going over testing again, as we did last week. The process will be, members, we're going to have both presentations go forward, and then we will have questions of the presenters jointly after we're done. I appreciate you coming, and does my co-chairman have any remarks before we get started? So with that, members, I believe we are going to go ahead and get started. Ms. Hansen, I believe you are first. You are recognized to give your presentation to the committee. And if you would, when you speak into the microphone for both the presenters, we are broadcasting and archiving all of these meetings. So, and there are people listening also over the internet and over the radio. So when you start speaking, if you would introduce yourself, that would be very helpful, and tell us who you are and who you're with. Thank you very much. You're recognized.
Sure. Thank you, Representative, and Senator McCourtney, and members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Carmen Hansen, and I'm here from the National Conference of State Legislatures. We're headquartered in Denver, Colorado, and it's a privilege to be here in Oklahoma City with you all today. For those of you that aren't familiar with the National Conference of State Legislatures, we are the membership organization for the 7,383 state legislators across the country, and we're also the membership organization for over 30,000 legislative staff in the country. So we're bipartisan, and we take no position on any state level legislation, in particular including cannabis issues. So this is not a presentation about if a state should or should not do any kind of particular law or regulation, because that's all up for you to decide, and that's why you're here today. So we just, we're thankful to be able to share this information with you on what other states are doing. All right. So state legalization of marijuana or cannabis started back in California in 1996, and other states, mostly Western states, also legalized medical use by ballot initiative, which is more common in the Western states than the Eastern states. States began legalizing medical use via legislative members a few years ago, and now all but 4 states currently have some sort of legalized cannabis products in a publicly available program. That does not count a limited CBD, cannabidiol pilot study in Nebraska, and there's a Kansas law that legalizes cannabidiol if the FDA does so first, or the federal government legalizes it, as well as the South Dakota law, which removed cannabidiol from their definition of marijuana. But just because those states have some sort of a law doesn't mean that it's a broadly used public program. The rest of my slides will provide more information on medical cannabis programs and testing laws. I'm just going to do a really quick synopsis here of the medical programs to help you with context with how you have all gotten here today. As I mentioned, California was the first state to allow medical use of cannabis, and since then 31 states, DC, Guam, and Puerto Rico have followed, most of which since 2000, making for a total of those 34 programs. As I mentioned, approval of these programs is pretty evenly split between ballot initiative and legislative measure. And I'd like to note that not all of the approved programs have been fully implemented. It can take anywhere from 6 months to 24 months to get a program up and running, just depending on the processes involved with each state. And everyone here can relate, since this is where Oklahoma is right now. As you can expect, no 2 medical marijuana programs are alike, but some similarities do exist. Most programs include provisions for the following things, like patient registries, grower and caregiver provisions and registries. The purchasing limits or the amount of possession limits can vary. Things like purchasing between 1 ounces and 8 ounces of flower product or THC containing material at a given time. And some states don't limit the number of licensed dispensaries in an area with a hard number, and other states do. For example, Connecticut limits their dispensaries to 6 in the entire state. Granted, it's a pretty small state compared to Oklahoma, and even Minnesota limited their initial program to 4 dispensaries. And when it comes to growers and dispensaries, local zoning and licensing procedures may control if they may legally operate. In Colorado, for example, many cities and counties do not allow for the commercial growing or dispensing within their jurisdiction. However, a few state laws do not allow localities to restrict dispensaries, so they may not operate. Licensing and registries, those processes vary widely. All but one state has a list of qualifying conditions allowed for medical use. And some programs are silent on these initial types of regulations, particularly recognizing patients from other states. That's one of the areas that isn't necessarily decided in the initial stages. It takes time to establish rules and regulations after these bills or initiatives are passed. And some states are established their legislation or ballot measure, while in other states those details are left to a governing board or a task force or rulemaking authority or something like you have here, the legislative process. Product testing provisions are one of the secondary considerations and not typically included in initial legislation, and this is the situation in Oklahoma. I want to point out that the state health departments generally operate the medical cannabis programs. However, a few are run by attorneys general and offices of consumer protection, public safety, or justice. And like anything else, medical use of cannabis has its advocates and critics, both on the medical and adult use sides. Shortly after California legalized, the Institute of Medicine came out with its own opinion. It found that marijuana helped some patients with pain relief, and any side effects were generally very short-lived and well tolerated. In later 2012, the Treatment Research Institute released its own opinion based on addiction-related research, and they do not advise using cannabis for medical use. In more recent years, other disease-specific and patient advocacy groups have varied in their support for medical marijuana for the treatment of pain, nausea, and other issues. Some groups that do not currently support its use would reconsider with additional FDA and scientific research and standards supporting effectiveness. Again, some organizations have lists of support positions like smart approaches to marijuana. A friendly reminder, and it probably goes without saying for all of you, but marijuana remains a Schedule I product federally, meaning it's seen as having no acceptable medical use. However, in 2009, the Obama administration stated that they would not actively pursue or prosecute those adhering to the state laws in those particular states that had medical programs. Earlier this year, Attorney General Sessions rescinded the Obama-era Cole memo, allowing U.S. attorneys discretion to prosecute cannabis businesses in a medical or adult use states. So far, no U.S. attorney has publicly announced any changes in prosecuting state-allowed operating businesses. Some state attorneys have made statements saying that they will not prosecute legally operating state-licensed businesses because it's not seen as a priority compared to other concerns, including illicit drug use and the opioid epidemic. Federal, state, and local law enforcement continues to investigate bad actors in this industry and prosecuting as appropriate. Here's a quick summary of 2018 legislation with current bills to allow either for medical use, adult regulated use, or both. And the red states means that they have died for this legislative session. In adult use, we were expecting about 24 bills from the states listed, and some of those were carryovers from last legislative session. In medical, we have roughly 14 bills, and those were either new or carried over as well. These would be entirely new programs. So for the states like Nebraska and Kansas, they don't have an existing program. And then the others that have bills for this year currently have like a low THC program that may be operating. And some ballot initiatives so far have qualified for the ballot. Michigan is an adult use, and Oklahoma right now is the only state to pass a new medical program by the ballot measure this year. Some states have proposal to amend current programs that are operating, and those are not included in this list. And I can guarantee you that your days of establishing rules and regulations will continue far into the future with your program. There were also significant pieces of legislation related to cannabis, generally like decriminalization and other law enforcement related penalties. And those are not about regulating for adult use or medical use, and my colleagues in our criminal justice program follow those issues. And even though the vast majority of cannabis programs have been approved by voters, the legislature still plays an important role in these programs. Legislators like yourselves are drafting legislation, regulations, or enabling language in response to the ballot initiatives. Some have direct oversight of implementation and evaluation of programs and procedures. Some of the most common areas of regulation are established by legislators are the establishment of fees, licenses, tax structures, enforcement, and regulation funding. Oversight is typically assigned to another state department like the Department of Public Health, Revenue, or another agency. And as I mentioned, many of the states allow localities to further regulate or prohibit locations and operations of cannabis-based businesses within their county or city limits. In those situations, the state is typically creating an initial floor of legislation and not always a ceiling. A few states limit the types of regulations that they may impose just so a business can legally operate. And it's no surprise to hear that regulations and oversight of cannabis testing varies widely from state to state. Laws, regulations, and standards exist at different levels of government and industry. The next speaker, Jeremy Applin, will get into some more details in these areas. State legislators are typically crafting the laws governing the programs, including testing, often establishing an agency to create additional regulations and responsibilities. Standards are best practices created by smaller groups, such as industry associations, to help companies follow the governing regulations and laws. And as of right now, there is no single set of agreed upon standards or practices in the testing realm. Not that groups aren't trying, and again, Jeremy will give a lot more information on this. And one of the main reasons why this is so difficult is due to the Schedule I nature of cannabis. This prohibits many federal agencies from regulating for the use of fertilizers, insecticides, and pesticides on cannabis plants. That said, there are many states, cities, nations, and industry groups working on suggested standards in testing and production practices. State and local agencies may provide standards, rules, and regulations, but oversight varies. A few states own all of their testing labs, but it's more typical that the states are testing and licensing private testing firms who contact with the product producers. This issue is also complicated. It isn't about testing one type of widget. There's a wide range of products available, so it's important to consider what should be tested, when it should be tested, and why. Again, Jeremy can share his knowledge and expertise firsthand about that process. And some companies have their own internal testing during production, but that's more about consistency, and it's for things like weights and measurements. Say if you're creating an edible product, making sure that your little serving is 1 ounce or a ½ ounce or whatever it might be. And so they're not necessarily testing for things like contaminants at that level in-house. Here are a few examples of testing and oversight variations. In Colorado, the State Department Health Lab provides oversight and guidance to commercial testing labs. They create a reference library and testing methods, and an outside lab then makes the samples to test for things like cannabidiol content or cannabinoid content, molds, fungus, yeast, bacterial contamination, solvent residue, pesticides, metals, and foreign materials. California licenses their commercial laboratories for a similar range of items. Connecticut licenses and registers commercial testing labs, and New York licenses labs with DEA licenses, and they are approved by the State Health Department. Washington State Department of Agriculture has an approved list of pesticides, which is rare but becoming a more common activity. Alaska currently has a working group on developing testing standards, and currently Arizona has no testing requirement, but is also working on legislation to do so. Some concerns remain about laboratory DEA licenses being violated from testing cannabis products because they may be profiting off of a Schedule I product, which is a federal offense. And this is some of the publicly available policy overviews. The Association of Public Health Laboratories is tracking this issue and developing industry-wide best practices, which Jeremy has been part of that process in the past. And the Foundation of Cannabis Unified Standards also has an overview that they created in May of 2016. And I also want to point out that the National Cannabis Summit materials from 2017, which are largely available online, they had a lot of really fascinating sessions on the latest research and related issues. Not a ton on testing, but it just has really interesting background and health information. So that concludes my very brief high-level overview that I've prepared today. And if you have additional questions, I'm happy to take those later, or you may contact me with my information on the screen. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Members, as I said, we're going to wait and have questions till after both presenters present. Mr. Applin, you are recognized to present to the committee.
always bringing that up. Thank you very much for having me here today. My name is Jeremy Applin, and while I work with Focus in some capacities, my primary professional responsibilities are as the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Atlas GXP, which is a quality management software platform, as well as serving as the Vice Chairman of the ASTM Committee D37 to develop internationally harmonized standards for the cultivation, processing, manufacturing, testing, and distribution and security of cannabis in the cannabis industry. Today I'm going to do my best to give you an overview of some of the considerations that might be taken into account while developing regulations and rules around testing for the cannabis industry. So why do we test? Testing is really intended to serve as the final verification.
Mr. Applin?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, and I'm sorry to interrupt you. You can see your slide right there, and you might want to talk into the microphone.
Yeah, no, I have a tendency to kind of...
No, that's okay. Believe me, as soon as anybody does, and I get 13 text messages. So,
no, thank you very much.
Yeah, so right in there. But thank you.
Thank you, sir. So testing is really intended to serve as the final verification that the quality control measures that should be in place during cultivation, processing, and manufacturing operations are working as they're intended to ensure that those products meet specifications for purity, consistency, and strength. In plain language, what this means is that testing is really intended to confirm that cultivators, processors, and manufacturers are maintaining regulatory compliance. It's also intended to ensure that products are safe and of consistent dosage as they enter into the consumer market. And testing is also there to support process improvement within cultivation, processing, and manufacturing operations. If we're going to use test data to drive process improvement or to guide regulatory enforcement or to ensure product safety and consistency, it's also really important that everyone has confidence in those test results. That's not always the case. A survey that was recently conducted by C3RN, which is a research organization in partnership with the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, sent out a survey and got responses back from a little over 1,000 people to 70 different questions, gauging their confidence and other feelings around their experience with cannabis-based products. One of those questions was oriented towards what the level of confidence in THC content and CBD content that was appearing on labels in cannabis products. And what they found inside of that survey was that nearly half of the people that responded had moderate to no confidence in the accuracy of the THC content that was reported on the label that came from test results. And this is a really big concern because if we don't have consumers having trust in what's on the label, then they're really applying their best guess as to what products they should purchase and what level of quantity of that product that they should then consume. And so if somebody's kind of guessing or self-titrating is what we call it, there's an increased potential for them to incidentally overdose themselves and experience negative impact as they go through their day from the psychotropic effects of THC, or on the other end of the spectrum, to not experience the relief from symptoms that they were hoping to. And so beyond that, it really falls into, if you have a consumer population that isn't trusting the lab data that's being generated, it also creates challenges for regulatory organizations to maintain adequate oversight of the industry because they're constantly being questioned. In most markets, we see regulatory enforcement really being driven by issues that are identified during testing. So have we identified a contaminant? Are we accurate with our dosage? We start seeing those outliers, and that's the red flag that motivates regulatory enforcement officials to get out into the field and start asking what's going on inside of the industry. So how do we really begin to expand or evolve confidence? My personal opinion is that accreditation to existing standards is a really positive baseline. We have organizations like ISO and ELAC and more recently ASTM that have stepped into the arena of developing, ISO 17025 has been a benchmark for laboratory quality control systems for decades. NELAC has environmental laboratory quality control system requirements. And so these are highly recognized, widely deployed standards for maintaining quality inside of a laboratory environment. ASTM is now building off of that and creating standards that are unique or specific to laboratories that are handling cannabis samples. And so when we have a standardized approach to quality management within an industry, it really creates a pathway for investigation. So if I'm a regulator and I need to go in and inspect a laboratory to determine whether or not they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, if their documentation is either non-existent or it's all over the place, it makes it really difficult and challenging and time-consuming for me to root through that information to try to answer the questions that I might have. And so, again, these quality management systems form a very nice foundation and pathway for investigators and regulators to do their job. Having that consistency and continuity between documentation and control systems between laboratories that are operating inside of the marketplace also lends a degree of confidence in the data that's being generated. Quality management systems provide, robust controls around how processes are done, the data that's captured around them, so we have a very clear stream of information and the outputs. And ultimately, what all of this does, if it's communicated appropriately between all of the industry stakeholders, is that it begins to drive trust between industry regulators and consumers because everybody's looking at the same things in the same way. So I've talked about quality management now a couple of different times, both in the context of the production side as well as in laboratories. So I think it would be good to just kind of touch on what quality management is. In its most basic format, it distills down to 3 distinct elements, and it's defining what are we doing in the form of written policies, how are we doing it in the form of written procedures, and then maintaining the ability to prove that we do what we say that we're doing in the exact way that we say that we're doing it. And that's kind of a mouthful. What that translates to is record keeping. So I'm going to draft a policy that instructs how I'm going to do things. I'm going to draft a procedure that indicates exactly how I'm doing this one particular job, and then I'm going to have a data collection element in the format of forms or logs to record the data to prove that I was doing what I said that I was doing at the time that I said that I was doing it. Quality management really touches every aspect of business operations, and it doesn't matter if you're looking at a laboratory, a cultivation organization, or a processor or manufacturer. We have policies, or should have policies, procedures, and record-keeping requirements around everything from training through out-of-specification investigations in a laboratory environment, and for producers through complaint returns and recall processes. So just to touch a little bit on how this would work in real-world application, if I'm a laboratory that's received maybe an infused product that has specifications that it's supposed to be dosed at 100 milligrams of THC per unit, and I'm the laboratory, I receive that sample, I put it through my analytical process, and I find out at the end of my analysis that this product actually has 140 milligrams in it instead of 100 milligrams. What I need to do at that point is initiate an out-of-specification investigation. So I have to go back and I have to look at all of my policies and procedures, starting with training, and I ask myself and ask my documentation, is the technician who performed this task qualified to perform that task? Is their training to perform that task current, or have they not done this in a long time? And then I'm going to follow through and I'm going to look and see what equipment was used, was that equipment appropriately maintained, was it calibrated appropriately? And if the answer to all of those questions is yes, then I can push that data set out and hand it back to the manufacturer. And the manufacturer then is responsible for looking at it and following the same sequence of investigation around their internal operations to determine where the misdosage may have occurred. If they find a place where that problem was introduced, then they have a responsibility to identify how they're going to correct that problem. Maybe we're disposing of the product, maybe we can rework it and get it to an accurate dosage point. And then we have to document how we're going to prevent that mistake from happening again in the future. And this is corrective and preventative actions, which are very common throughout all industries that are subject to quality management. So where does testing fit into this? When we look at the product life cycle for cannabis products, there's a number of different steps that are going on. So we think about, we're gonna start growing a plant, so we have a seed, or maybe we're gonna cut a clone, we're gonna germinate that seed, instigate the clone to start producing roots, we're gonna grow that up into a full mature plant, and then we're gonna change some conditions, and we're gonna signal that plant should now start flowering or creating buds. Once the buds have matured, we're gonna harvest the plant, we're gonna take that flower material, we're gonna dry them, and we're gonna cure them, and once that's completed, we can take that plant material and we can really go two different directions, or maybe we're gonna go both directions at the same time. One route is to take that flower material, transfer it over, have it tested, transfer it into a dispensary or a retail outlet for sale to patients or consumer populations. The other pathway is to take it and put it through an extraction process. And in the extraction process, we're going to separate the compounds of interest, be they cannabinoids, terpenes, or other compounds from the plant material itself. We're gonna end up with a concentrate, and we can take that concentrate and we can either use it as an intermediate ingredient to create another product, or we can take that concentrate and we can put it through testing and sell it through a retail outlet to the consumer population. When we use that concentrate as an intermediate ingredient is when we start to see some disparity around how states approach regulate testing. Almost all markets require that finished flower product be tested before it goes for sale. Almost all states require that concentrates be tested before they're used as an intermediate ingredient. The reason we have to test the concentrate before we use it as an intermediate ingredient is because we have to know how much THC is in there to be able to accurately dose the product. Once we've manufactured a product, be it a cookie, a butter, brownies, suppositories, capsules, whatever the case may be, is when we start to see fragmentation of testing regulations between markets. Each unique product that's manufactured has its own recipe behind it, right? So person A may make cookies one way, person B may make cookies another way. So if I want to test what the level of THC is in each of those cookies, I need to make sure that my method, my analytical method that I'm using is accurate for that particular matrix, is what we refer to it as. And in order to prove that my analytical method is accurate, I have to validate my process and validate the results. Validation can be extraordinarily time-consuming and expensive. And a lot of industry stakeholders aren't really understanding of that specificity to their particular products, and so they want laboratories to absorb that cost. And in order for laboratories to absorb that cost, they maybe have to have additional instrumentation that's solely dedicated to performing validations while they're still performing testing of other materials that are on their way to market. And so what we see states doing is saying, okay, our industry or our market isn't mature enough yet. We don't have enough products on the market. We as a regulatory agency are still learning on it. So we're gonna push the pause button, and we'll come back to this later on. When we push the pause button on testing finished manufactured products, we're also opening ourselves up to a pretty tremendous amount of liability. If I'm making something like a cookie, I'm using eggs, and we don't hear it too often anymore, but eggs were historically notorious for carrying salmonella. And so if we're not cooking the cookies long enough, and they haven't been exposed to enough heat to kill all the microbes in them, there's a risk that's particularly pertinent to those individuals in medical programs who are suffering from immunocompromisation. And I'll talk about this a little bit later and give an example of how a mistake really impacted a transplant recipient. And so just to kind of summarize this slide, testing fits in at almost every finished step inside of the production process, but it also drives this question of, do we need to test for everything at every step in the production process? The answer to that is maybe. It depends on what regulatory approach is undertaken. It's really easy, I think, for regulators to say, we're limited in time resources and we don't have the ability to be in the field and reviewing processes inside of manufacturers, and so yeah, we're just going to test for everything all of the time and pass that cost along to the producers. What we see in most other regulated industries is the application of hazard analysis and critical control point principles. And what HACCP does is it requires cultivators or manufacturers to look at their process for what they're doing inside of their organization and determine risk potential for contamination or other issues that may occur at each step, and then identify mechanisms to reduce that risk. So maybe we're testing, maybe we can apply heat to minimize the risk and then test at a later step, or apply pressure. There's a number of different routes that can be taken with this. So in considering this in terms of real-world application, maybe we've harvested a batch of flowers and we look at that and we want to take that flower material and we want to use it in an extraction process to pull out the THC. Some of the things that we might consider are, hey, we've got this lot of flower, is it going to sit for 6 months before we put it through the extractor? If it's going to sit for a long time, we may want to have really good insight into the water activity or moisture content of this. When we have high water activity or high moisture content, it really facilitates the growth of bacterial or fungal organisms, which may, particularly in the case of fungus, they may produce a category of compounds called aflatoxins, which are extremely carcinogenic. And so if we have high mold and we have aflatoxins and then we go through this extraction process, we may have set ourselves up for having a product that has a lot of carcinogens in it that can't then subsequently be used. We may also want to look at water activity from a self-interested point, where having water present in the plant material might affect the solvents that are used during extraction by diluting them. We may want to look at potency to determine the efficiency or efficacy of our extraction process. Are we getting everything out that we want to get out of it, or are we leaving THC or other cannabinoids, which effectively translates to dollars, behind in the plant material? From a regulatory perspective, we might want to test that flower material for pesticide residues to see if the cultivator complied with our regulations around pesticide application. It's kind of following the same use case through. I've gone through the extraction process. I have a bucket of extract that has hopefully THC and CBD and terpenes and other compounds of interest in it. I'm going to want to test that again for potency, but from a regulatory perspective, I may also want to test for pesticides again. So if we say, for example, a cultivator applied a pesticide very early on in the life cycle of that plant, there's a possibility that that pesticide residue may have broken down over the 6 or so months that it took to bring that plant to maturity. And if I'm a regulator and I really want to know if something was applied, during the extraction process, we're concentrating things down. We're not just extracting and concentrating cannabinoids. We can concentrate other chemicals that may be on the plant as well. And so by testing a concentrate for pesticide residue, we have better resolution around whether or not a pesticide may have been identified or used in the cultivation process, and that can then be used to direct regulatory enforcement activities. When we get to the finished product category, this is, again, our final verification. This is our last chance to catch something. And this is really the place that we want to test for everything under the sun that would be a potential risk factor to the patient or the consumer population. So we're going to look at potency. We're going to look again at micro, water activity. Water activity is a determinant of the ability of microbiological contaminants to grow or proliferate during storage or past the point of distribution. Then we start looking at other things too, like heavy metals, pesticide residues again, and then residual solvents. These are solvents that may, residues of solvents that may have been used inside of the extraction process. Excuse me. Cameron, can I have a So while testing is really important, and it's a fundamental component of quality management and protecting consumer safety, there are also barriers to really having and maintaining an effective testing program. From the laboratory industry side, it is extraordinarily expensive to start a laboratory. Equipment is not cheap. For, like to purchase a HPLC to do potency analysis or quantification of the cannabinoids. Entry level for a well operating system used is about $30,000. When we start looking at heavy metal analysis, the gold standard for that is a piece of equipment called an inductively coupled mass spectrometer. You're looking at, with a questionable system, about $100,000 and up from there. If we get fancier with our technology, it's not hard to move into the $250,000 to $300,000 range for a single piece of equipment. It's also expensive to develop the laboratory quality control system. So if we're going to go for ISO 17025 compliance and meet that accreditation standard, we have to spend a lot of time, human man hours, on developing the documentation and thinking through our process, writing it all down, and then controlling those documents, because every time we change something, we have to go through an approval process. If we're not familiar with the standard, then we may have to hire a consultant, and it's not uncommon for consulting fees around 1702 compliance to drive into the tens of thousands of dollars. And then just to reiterate this point, if I have to develop methods and validate methods for each unique product that I'm testing, here again we have reagent costs, labor costs, and equipment costs to facilitate that. And when we think about consumer confidence or regulatory confidence and data that's being generated by laboratories, anytime you apply economic pressure to an organization that's operating, it's human nature to want to start to cut corners. And so making sure that the laboratory is capable of operating a viable business is directly connected to having quality testing results generated. Another critical component to having an effective testing program is regulatory oversight. And in a lot of markets, in fact, I'd venture to say most markets, what we find is that regulatory agencies are very heavily taxed in terms of their time and budget availability to be able to go out and review documents and records and operations inside of laboratories, as well as cultivation operations, processors, and manufacturers. A lot of times these folks are knowledge deficient as well. A lot of states have recruited restaurant inspectors to inspect cannabis facilities. And when you take somebody out of a restaurant environment and suddenly put them in a manufacturing environment, they're not a one-to-one. And so it's really important for different departments inside the State Department of Health or within the state at large to have the ability to be able to communicate with one another and have each other's time. And this is something that I think is really important for members of the state legislature. In talking to regulators around the country, what I've heard time and time and time again is, oh my gosh, I would love to talk to somebody over at the state lab division, or a lab personnel member saying, oh my gosh, I would absolutely love to be able to talk to somebody that's a field agent inside of the Department of Health, but I do not have permission from the legislature inside of the context of the law to do that. And my department or the other department does not have the budget to pay for the time for their personnel to spend with me to help me really understand how to connect all of these dots to have adequate regulatory enforcement. Another really big challenge at the municipal and the state level is potential cost of litigation. In many, many, many markets, what we see is a member of the regulatory team identifies a need for regulation to increase or oversight to increase, and they start talking to industry, or whispers get out and industry catches wind of this, and industry says, oh my gosh, that's overburdensome. You're going to cost me a ton of money, I won't be able to stay in business. They talk to the patient or the consumer base and say, hey, look, if the state or the municipality passes this new law, our costs are going to go up, your costs are going to go up, and we're all going to suffer. A lot of folks that are patients inside of medical cannabis programs have limited economic power. Many folks are on social assistance, and so there's a tremendous amount of fear of prohibitive costs for them to access these commodities in order to alleviate the symptoms that they're experiencing. And what all this ends up happening is everybody rallies together, they start putting pressure on the regulatory agency or on their representatives at the state, and threaten lawsuits, and everybody's worried about their budget and spending money, and so then we stop. And it's understandable in some contexts, but it's also, I think, well, I know in talking to the regulatory officials that I've spoken with, their primary directive is to protect the interests of public health. And if we look at the history of the evolution of food and drug laws in the United States, there's decades of advancement that have happened, and most people are, to one degree or another, blind to the rules and laws and activities out there that really protect us from simple things, even like bread. If you read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle in high school or in college, that's a really prime example of where kind of we started at the beginning of the 20th century. So moving on, again, just to restate this, what are we looking for when we do testing? We're looking at potency, biological contaminants, water activity and moisture content and their relationship to biological contaminants, pesticides, heavy metals, residual solvents, and contaminants and filth. I was really happy to see contaminants and filth addressed in both of the proposed lab regulations for Oklahoma. This is something that I think is oftentimes overlooked. When we're speaking about contaminants and filth, it's stuff like maybe hair. Are we wearing appropriate outer garments? But it's also stuff like metal. I was working with an organization a couple of years ago. There was an employee inside of the extraction facility that was using a wire brush to clean utensils and equipment, and the wire brush started to fray, and filaments were falling out of it and ended up in a jar of concentrate. And fortunately for that organization, the individual who's responsible for post-extraction processing identified this, and they were able to filter out all the metal filaments prior to that concentrate being used to dose chocolate bars. And so their internal review system with quality management mitigated the risk of a patient or a consumer eating a chocolate bar and getting a metal filament stuck in their throat or in their stomach. Let's dig in a little bit deeper here and talk about potency analysis. Anytime that we're doing any kind of an analytical test, the quality of that test is directly tied to the quality of the sample that was collected. So if in science, we call it garbage in, garbage out. If we're putting garbage into the system, we're going to get garbage out. And a little bit more sophisticated language, what we're saying is, if the sample isn't representative of the batch from which it was withdrawn, then the analytical data is only correlatable back to the sample itself and not back to the broader batch, right? So if you think about this in terms of potency analysis, cannabis industry isn't selling cannabis. What they're selling is cannabinoids. We know that if we select a very large, thick, dense bud from the top portion of the plant, it's going to have a higher THC content than a smaller, airier bud taken from the lower branches. And so in sample collection, there's a tendency to want to be biased towards high THC content because we're going to have better sales, right? In addition to that, when we look at, what are we looking for? I think it was great that the proposed regulations in Oklahoma address the need to test not only for the nutriform of the cannabinoids, THC, but also the acidic form, THCA, which is the form that THC exists in the highest quantities in the native plant, right? So THC is psychotropic, THC is not quite so much. Excuse me. In order to get the psychotropic effect, we have to heat the product, which is why we smoke it, or we bake it, or we apply some sort of a heat. What that heat does is it causes a reaction called the thermogenic decarboxylation reaction, where we're yanking off that A, right? So that A is an acidic functional group. We apply heat, We pull that thing off, and now we have delta-9 THC, which is psychotropic, and elicits the effect that most patients and consumers are looking for. So when we think about analytical methodologies, it's important to consider that when we develop our approach. If we're using something like gas chromatography uses a very high heat temperature to volatilize the sample for detection. So when we're heating it up, we're ripping off that acidic functional group, and the only thing that we're going to be able to detect is THC. We're not going to know how much THCA is there. In order to account for that, before we run the analysis, we have to pull that A off, and we have to replace it with something else that's traceable through the system. In contrast to that, if we're using liquid chromatography, we're extracting the cannabinoids out. We don't change their chemical composition or conformation, and so we can run the sample through the system and not worry about any changes so much. Both of these factors lead to risk of potential overdose or underdose if the product isn't tested appropriately. Quick example of this is I ran a lab for several years in the cannabis industry, and I had a customer call me up and they said, hey, we had this other laboratory test our concentrate, and they told us it was 86% weight by weight THC. So we used that to mathematically determine how much concentrate to use in infusing our chocolate bars. We did this, we put it on the market, and now patients are calling us and telling us that there's no way on earth that there's that much THC in this product. It wasn't effective for them to alleviate their symptoms. So I brought the concentrate in, we retested it using a liquid chromatography system, and what we identified was that the THC content in the concentrate was only about 46%. And so they underdosed the product by half. And this translates to a degree to consumer fraud, right? If we put on a label that this thing has 100 milligrams in it and it's really only got 50 milligrams in it, we pulled the wool over our customers' eyes. Again, inside of the cannabis industry, kind of bringing it full circle back to laboratory quality control systems, regulatory oversight, and credentialing of cannabis laboratories. In a lot of markets, we see cultivators and manufacturers shopping for labs, meaning that they're looking around for the laboratory that's going to give them the highest numbers, because the highest THC number is the product that's going to sell first on the shelf. Another example of this is I had a friend contact me a few years ago. He is a concentrate manufacturer in a pretty well-established market with regulatory oversight of the laboratories. And he says, hey, I've been using this lab. I know the guy is really knowledgeable. I know that their results are accurate. I'm losing shelf space for my products because there's another laboratory out here that is reporting very high THC contents. So this guy, with the lab that he had been using, was hovering around like 65 to 70% weight by weight THC. This other laboratory was reporting THC content as high as 110%, right? So that's not very realistic. He says, what should I do? And I said, well, are both laboratories approved by the state? And he said, yeah, they are. And I said, okay. I said, well, you know, it's a moral quandary, right? Because you have a responsibility to your business and a responsibility to yourself and a responsibility to your employees. It's the state's responsibility to maintain oversight of these laboratories and ensure that they're reporting accurate data. If the state has credentialed this other laboratory, even though it's hard to do and it violates your ethics, to save your business, you almost have to go and use this other lab to keep your product on the shelf. And that's what he ended up doing. So these are just some examples of how laboratory data can impact business and consumer confidence. The final case study that I'll talk about with potency analysis is something that I ran into last year, where a vertically integrated producer in a southwestern state took a batch of flower material and sent it over to a toll processor to turn it into an extract. And so they transferred the material over. A couple weeks later, the concentrate came back, and it came back with test results. and the THC content was extraordinarily low. Normally, this producer had THC concentrations in their concentrates of between 60 and 70%. And in this case, the finished product had around 8.6% weight by weight THC. And so we looked at the data and we said, oh my gosh, where on earth did all of the THC go? Because that's a lot of money if you're losing it. We contacted the laboratory and we said, what did you see when you ran this analysis? And they said, oh, well, the THC is there, but it's not THC. It's an isomer of THC. So it's similar, but slightly different. And we have this big, huge peak, and we're not really sure what it is, but it'll get you high. Don't worry about it, right? And so we talked about it internally, and we were like, no, this isn't right. We tried to get copies of the raw data from the laboratory. The laboratory said, our methodology is proprietary, and we're not going to show the data to you. My response to them was, I'm a chemist. I'd like to see the elution times, and they're like, nope, that'll give you insight into our methodology, so they completely locked us out. So we contacted the Department of Health and started an internal dialogue about whether or not we should initiate a recall. In the interim, we pulled the product off the shelf and threw it in the freezer to maintain the stability. We waited for a week or two from the Department of Health. They took all this information, but we had no follow-up. So we started asking ourselves this question of, are we going to see an adverse event? Because when we talk about isomers of delta-9 THC, what we're really talking about is spice, right? Spice and bath salts. Some of you may remember, God, it's probably going back about 5 years ago now, where there was an individual in Florida who attacked another individual and tried to eat their face off, and follow-up investigation around that. The attacker identified that he had been consuming bath salts or spice, which most of the time those are research-grade compounds that are isomers of delta-9 THC that were used, in early research around cannabinoids that people pulled the scientific literature on and figured out how to synthesize them. So when we asked this question about, hey, we don't want to have a mental health incident related to this product, are we going to see a report of this if somebody were to have an adverse event? We realized no. It's probably a very, very, very low likelihood. And the reason for that is because healthcare providers don't ask. And it's not a malicious thing that they don't ask, it's that they haven't been trained to, and they don't understand, because of the lack of training, that there's a necessity to do that. If we go through pharmacy school or medical school or physicians, PA training or nursing school, we are trained, we get it beaten into us to say, on first contact with the patient, what medications are you taking? Are you taking any dietary supplements? Are you taking any vitamins? We're not training healthcare providers to ask, are you using cannabis, right? So we have an opportunity to misinformation in epidemiological tracking. We also see most cannabis consumers have a perception that the product is inherently safe. We've all heard people say, people have been smoking pot for 5,000 years and nobody's ever died of an overdose. It's true. What we do know for sure, though, is that there are case reports of fatalities related to biological contaminants. And so that perception of safety makes it very difficult for the consumer population to draw potential clinical correlations between an adverse event that they're experiencing and the product that they may have recently consumed. In emerging medical markets, there's also a fear of retribution. I suspect that you guys are probably getting on some level feedback from physicians right now that we don't want to refer people into the program. The other end of that spectrum is if I'm a patient and I've gone and I've gotten a referral from someone other than my primary care, there is a lot of history of patients disclosing to their primary care that, hey, I'm now using cannabis therapeutically, and the physician saying, oh my gosh, I can't see you anymore, and dropping them from care, right? And so that's when we start to look at fear of retribution and barriers to really reporting and connecting the dots between adverse events and cannabis product consumption. We then asked ourselves, why wasn't this being investigated by the state? It's pretty frustrating when you have tens of thousands of dollars worth of product sitting on your shelves and you're afraid to sell it and you can't get any input or assistance from the regulatory agency after you've disclosed, like, hey, we found this thing, we think it's bad, help us out here. we were pretty judgmental at first, and then we kind of took a step back and we started thinking through it. And we're like, hey, this is a really small department. They've got 2 field inspectors that came from restaurant inspection backgrounds. They're learning cannabis right now. They don't have the time. This is an extremely complicated case, right? Did the lab make a mistake? Did the processor make a mistake? What happened inside of here? It takes a lot of brain power to sort through that. In this particular market, there also wasn't legislative approval for interagency cooperation. And so there was a big invisible boundary that said, you're the medical cannabis program and the state lab division over here that has the expertise. You can't communicate in resolving or identifying this issue. And again, in this particular market, there was a very strong history of regulators saying, we're going to do this now, and the industry saying, oh, absolutely not, you're not. And then lawyering up and starting to file lawsuits or having activated the consumer population and kind of feeding them a line of mistruths, engaging those folks to serve their goal of keeping their costs low. Moving on to microbiology. Again, sample collection is a really big factor inside of this. While the big, really dense flowers might have very high potency, they also have an increased proclivity to support biological growth in the form of bacteria or mold. They're going to dry more slowly, so you have more moisture content there for longer, and you've got all these protected domains, and it creates a really nice kind of a nursery environment for biological organisms to proliferate. If you want to pass micro, what you do is you go for the smaller, lighter area buds that are going to have be drier, lower water activity, less protected areas for these organisms to really sit and replicate over time. And so you'll see, if I'm a lab that's struggling and I want to keep my business, I might take advantage of that knowledge and go into an organization that I know has a history of poor outcomes with micro testing, and I might skew my sample collection in the direction of smaller, lighter area buds to help them out. Another thing that we've seen show up in certain markets is laboratory operators telling people, ah, yeah, just go ahead and pop some of your material into the microwave or use a UV wand. You guys may have seen these things. They're about $50 online. Use them to sterilize kids' toys. They're an ultraviolet light. You know, wave it over the top of it. And using that, it's ultraviolet light in the C wavelength below 280 nanometers, you can break down the DNA of things like mold or bacteria and prevent them from replicating. And those things can be used to increase the likelihood of passing micro. But you're not treating the entire batch. You're only treating a small portion of it, right? The portion that's actually going to undergo testing. All of this, that kind of goes back to my earlier comment about economic pressure on laboratories. And these are the kinds of things that you see happening when laboratories aren't making enough money to support their operations. Another critical component around microbiology is in considering what's an appropriate threshold for the organisms that we're testing for. If we go to the grocery store and we buy a head of lettuce or we buy a bunch of spinach, there's an expectation that we'll take that product home and we'll wash it before we consume it. Nobody takes their cannabis home and washes it before they consume it. So we can't directly apply, what are safe limits for spinach to what are safe limits for cannabis. They're not a one-to-one because there's a different expectation for how we're going to handle that. So just to kind of demonstrate this, this table on the left-hand column, we see what an analysis might be. It might look like, are we testing for total aerobic count? Are we testing for combined yeast and mold, E. coli, and salmonella? USP 1111 are the microbiology thresholds for finished pharmaceuticals. USP 2023 are the microbiological thresholds for non-sterile articles of botanical origin intended for use as a dietary or nutritional supplement. And then the last column on the far right is what Oklahoma has proposed for its microbial limits today. And so if we look at the total combined yeast and mold, we see a one order of magnitude, or two order of magnitude difference between USP 1111 and USP 2023, and then again a one order of magnitude difference between USP 2023 and what is proposed for Oklahoma today. When we look at the differences between meeting these requirements, the difference between meeting USP 1111 and USP 2023 in terms of cost for a production organization is tens of thousands of dollars. For each order of magnitude that you go down, you have to have that much more robust controls and control over your environment, control over your processes and procedures, and you start getting into clean room type things. Take note at this point of the bile-tolerant gram-negative requirement and the lack of that requirement for what's proposed in the current Oklahoma regulations. In a minute, I'm going to talk about enterobacteria, which is connected to bile-tolerant gram-negatives. So here's a case study. This first case study, we're going to talk about laboratory errors. So this happened with a manufacturer. They had made a concentration that was intended to be distributed as a concentrate to medical patients. So they manufactured the product, packaged it, sent it out to a laboratory for testing. Test results came back and showed that the product failed for enterobacteria contamination as well as mold. The manufacturer looked at that data set and they said, we don't believe it. So they quarantined the product, put it on hold, and then began an internal investigation. So they had a pretty robust quality control system in place around their manufacturing operations. They went back and reviewed their policies, procedures, and record keeping. They verified that each employee in the product manufacturing process had done exactly what they were supposed to. They went back and they looked at their hazard analysis and critical control point plan, and they knew that this product had a very, very, very low water activity, so low that it would not support life in the form of biological growth, be it from bacteria or mold. And so what this indicated to the manufacturer was that in all likelihood, the contamination happened during the analytical process in the laboratory. The laboratory was contacted and they were asked to initiate an out-of-specification investigation, which they hadn't done previously. The lab was not credentialed to any type of a standard. They were following very basic state regulations. They didn't want to do the investigation, but we got them to. And after about 2 weeks, they came back and they said, oops, we learned a lot through this. And what they identified was that they had been sourcing commercially available reagents for their microbiological analysis, but they weren't testing those reagents before they were putting them into the testing process to see if the reagents themselves were contaminated, which they were. Which means that in retrospect, and the lab self-identified this, that over half of the samples that they had failed for biological contaminants were in fact false positives, and it was not caught. Not really a great outcome. It cost a lot of producers a lot of money in terms of reprocessing or disposing of product. The good thing that came out of it was that the lab was very receptive to their own findings and they started to evolve their internal quality control procedures. On the other end of the spectrum, we can look at the potential for human harm. This is a situation that I encountered about 6 years ago where an immunocompromised patient, he was a double kidney pancreas transplant recipient, showed up at his doctor's office with profound diarrhea, nausea, and vomiting, and was admitted to the hospital within 48 hours of smoking cannabis flower material. This drove the question, is there a clinical correlation? So a little bit more background on this particular situation. The patient had been given the flower material to conduct a taste test and then write a review on the product on the same day that samples were submitted to the laboratory, right? So there wasn't any quality assurance check around the product safety before it was passed off. It was a step outside of the regulation in this market. The analysis was performed, samples came back. This was a relatively small grow. There were 26 plants inside of the growing environment. All 26 plants were tested on an individual basis. When the data came back, 23 of the plants failed for contamination with enterobacteria above 100 colony forming units per gram. If you remember back to the table, the threshold for dietary supplements in bile-tolerant gram-negatives is 1,000, so we're one order of magnitude lower than what the dietary supplement thresholds are. And 23 of the 26 plants failed for mold above 1,000 colony-forming units per gram. The patient called the Department of Health and said, hey, I think that I've been made ill by consuming this cannabis commodity. And the first question that the Department of Health asked him was, what is your name? And he said, I'm not giving you my name. I'm a current federal employee, and I'm afraid of losing my job if this gets out. The Department of Health said, we absolutely have to have your name. And he said, no. The Department of Health didn't absolutely have to have his name. If that individual who answered the phone had been trained appropriately, they could have extracted the information that they needed to initiate an investigation, but they got hung up on it and ultimately hung up on the patient. So the state missed a huge opportunity to learn from this. The patient was pretty upset. He ended up spending a few days in the hospital. He contacted the original cultivator when he didn't get a good response from the state. The cultivator said, I don't believe you. My brother is a doctor, and my brother told me that if we're heating up plant material, there's no way on earth that bacteria or mold is going to survive that process. I ended up getting involved, talked to the cultivator, and offered to talk to his brother. He didn't want me to talk to his brother, so I talked to him, and I said, talk to your brother, and I said, talk to him about the mechanics and the physics of smoking. When we're smoking something, we're applying an ignition source to one area. We're not combusting the whole product to kill everything. So as we inhale, and we have this one ignition point, we're drawing rapidly cooling gas across other plant material, and we're picking up particulates. And those particulates can carry bacterial and fungal co-riders that can ultimately colonize in our esophageal or respiratory tract. And that's what happened with this individual. Cultivator got scared then and decided that he wanted to investigate this further. How did this happen? He's like, I've got a very expensive facility. My HVAC systems all have UV light in them. They're same grade that we find in operating rooms. He's like, I don't understand how this happened. So we went out and we had a map of where the plants were in the growing environment, and we looked at it. We did swabs of the environment to see if there was any contamination inside of the room, and there wasn't. So I spent a day following him around, and his grow operation was at his house, and he had a small ranch. And every day at lunchtime, he would go out and he would take care of his wife's horses. And he'd take hay, alfalfa out there, he'd feed the horses, groom the horses, spend a little bit of time with them, making him feel all warm and fuzzy, as was his wife's request. And then he'd go back to work. And he was not following his own outer garment policy. So he's been out in the pasture now, handling alfalfa and engaging with these horses with manure everywhere. And then he'd walk right back into his grow room. Well, his grow room was so densely packed with plants that he couldn't reach the back corner where those 3 plants that passed testing were at. And he showed me how he walked through the room, and we determined that he was the vector. And so when we look at integrated quality management systems between the testing environment and what's happening in cultivation or manufacturing environments, this is really where we learn. We have the opportunity to take test results, correlate those back to what's happening during production, and identify areas for process improvement. This was a really hard lesson for this individual to take because he figured out that he was the vector that almost killed somebody. Talk about pesticides a little bit. Pesticides in some ways are straightforward. All pesticides are illegal for application to cannabis at this point. No pesticide has been approved by the EPA. Pesticides have to be approved on a crop-specific basis for application. We see some exclusionary components around this, where if a pesticide meets the criteria described in the EPA's Code of Federal Regulations, 180.95 in sections B, C, or 7, those compounds can be used or applied to cannabis, used as an ingredient in a minimum risk pesticide product that is applied to cannabis. I'm not an expert in pesticides. This is a very deep domain. If you have additional really heavy-duty scientific questions about this, I'd be happy to introduce you to some other folks that are far more knowledgeable this than I am. At the end of the day, though, we as an industry have pretty insufficient information around exposure limits to establish toxicity-based tolerance for pesticide residues that may be found on cannabis products. What we've seen states do, Oregon is a prime example of this, they establish action levels based on a laboratory's limit of quantification. So the limit of quantification is the smallest amount of this that I can assign a numerical value to and say, this is how much of it's there. So what Oregon did was they talked to the laboratories that were operating in their market. They said, what are your limits of quantification? They averaged them and then multiplied them by 2. And so in Oregon now, if a product is tested and it is at or above that action level, then the state takes enforcement action and says, hey, you've applied an illegal pesticide to your product and you have to destroy it or whatever the case may be. Pesticides, we don't see a whole lot of acute case reports around pesticide exposure. I haven't seen any. I'm sure that there are some out there somewhere, either anecdotally or published. But I think it's really important to point out that given the concern and awareness around pesticide residues and the economic consequences that some organizations have faced as a result of using banned or illegal pesticides, we're now starting to see technology come forward that will accelerate the degradation of those compounds. So if I've applied a pesticide to my crop and I've harvested it and I'm worried about getting flagged during testing, then I can purchase or rent one of these magic boxes, put my plant material in there, hit the go button, and they are intended to break those pesticide residues down so that they are not detectable during regulatory analysis. This is problematic because a lot of times degradation products are more toxic than the original parent compound. So when you're writing the regulations or when you're talking to regulatory officials, this is something to kind of bear in mind. Like, to what depth are we looking? Are we looking for degradation products in addition to parent compounds, or are we only looking for the parent compound? Heavy metals are another category that we're still kind of learning about. What we do know is that cannabis is an extremely good bioaccumulator of heavy metals. That means is the cannabis plant can suck heavy metals out of the ground, store it in its tissue, and not let go, and keep taking it up and taking it up. We actually see applications for hemp in remediating polluted sites because of this capability. In large part, heavy metal uptake is a bigger concern for plants that are grown outdoors than indoors. The reason for that is if I'm growing indoors, either using commercially available soil or hydroponic methods, I know what my inputs are. If we go to Home Depot or someplace like that and we buy a bag of dirt, that dirt's been tested to make sure that there aren't high levels of mercury or cadmium in it before it can hit the shelves. So this means that somewhere out there, there's a certificate of analysis attached to that batch or lot of soil, and I can request that, and I can review that. With outdoor grows, we can do annual soil testing, and we can try to get a baseline on what's happening there. Same thing with water. If we're using municipal water or well water, annual testing will give us an idea of what the potential for heavy metal presence is inside of that. And then looking at soil amendments or nutrients, these products also need to be tested before they reach market. The cost of heavy metal testing can be very high, and so if we think about this in terms of we have these certificates of analysis, if we have standardized process to how we're growing a plant and we're always using the same soil, we're using the same water source, we're using the same amendments or nutrients or fertilizers, and we have that body of certificates of analysis, maybe we can get by with quarterly testing for heavy metals just to ensure that nothing has changed inside of the ecosystem. When we're looking at field sampling, we have to be incredibly conscious of sampling biased. I'm going to step a little bit out of heavy metals for just a second. Years ago, I encountered a case report that was written up about an organic farmer that had grown all these plants I think it was something like echinacea, right, for a dietary supplement. So he had USDA organic certification for his farm. Grew his entire crop for the year, harvested it, sent it out to a distributor. The distributor tested it, and it tested positive for DDT. DDT's been banned for a really long time, right? And so the farmer went crazy because this is his entire year's income sitting there, and they're telling him that it's got DDT in it. And he's telling them, you're out of your mind. I've got the certificate from USDA that I'm organic certified. And the laboratory and the distributor both said, something's not right here. And so they worked together to try to figure out what was going on. What happened was, when the farmer collected the soil sample to submit for his organic certification, he had a farmhand go out and pull it. Farmhand knew the farm really well. He knew the back half of the cultivation area was a lot of clay, and the front half was pretty soft and loamy soil. Who wants to go dig in clay? So he went to the soft area, and he collected the sample from there and didn't collect any of the clay. Clay can act as a reservoir for DDT for a very, very, very long time, and that's what happened. They did not have a representative sample, right? And so over half of the farm had DDT in the soil, and the results from the laboratory were in fact true. So when we think about testing field soils for heavy metals, or when we think about seeing pesticide residues inside of plants, we have to be mindful of how is the sample collected, was it representative, is there a potential for lag over in the case of pesticides, and et cetera, aka sampling bias. Moving on to residual solvents, there are currently no health-based solvent residual limits specifically for cannabis products. What we've seen the majority of the states do is look to the pharmaceutical industry for a model. And so the United States Pharmacopoeia National Formulary, version 18, chapter 467, provides guidance on the use of solvents inside of the pharmaceutical industry. This is another area where I'm not real strong in. So if you have more detailed questions, I'd be happy to put you in touch with somebody who's more adept at handling this stuff than I am. But in chapter 467 has been directly adopted by a lot of states because it identifies which solvents could be used for extraction as well as limits for those solvents inside of the extraction operations for cannabis-based products. Those solvents are broken down into 3 different categories. Categories 1 and 2 are either toxic or pose a significant enough health risk to not be used in the manufacturing of cannabis commodities, or you have category 3, which is a very low toxicity potential for humans with no health-based exposure limits. So to summarize, excuse me, testing is really the last line of defense to verify regulatory compliance and product safety. In order to have confidence in that data, laboratories should be credentialed to a widely accepted standard to form the foundation for the laboratory quality management system. Quality management should not be relegated only to the world of laboratory testing. By having it present in cultivation and manufacturing operations, it really drives the ability to correlate the resulting laboratory data and identify what's real and what's not. Testing requirements should reflect risk so as not to pose too heavy of a burden on industry while still being mindful of risk potentials that are there. And finally, not every question that we have today has a good answer yet. And collectively, we're undergoing a tremendous amount of learning. So the more that we can support and drive dialogue between states and regulatory agencies, and between regulatory agencies, laboratories, industry stakeholders, and consumers, the better off we'll be. Thank you very much, and be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Applin. Members, at this time, what I think I'm going to do before questions is we are going to take about a 9-minute break. I want everybody to be back here by 10:35. Members, we're going to try to start right on time. So let's take a quick break. At this time, we are going to enter into questions. I would like to, and we do have a quorum present of the committee of attendance. Co-Chair McCourtney, Senator McCourtney, you are recognized for your first question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before we get into the weeds, because we very much will here. I wanted to ask Mr. Applin, as the guy who kind of helped put this meeting together, I know how extremely qualified you are and how lucky we are to have you. In your introduction, it got a little confusing because you've got your hand in so many pots. If you could kind of tell us a little more of who you are and why you're here. And since you may not be the kind of guy who likes to toot your own horn, I will say that I believe that you are the, or if not the, one of the top leading experts in the nation. So if you can give us a little bit of your background so we know why it is that we really should listen to what you're saying today.
Thank you very much for the nice words. So my background, before entering into the cannabis industry, I was working for the Department of Veterans Affairs Cooperative Studies Program Clinical Pharmacy Coordinating Center. In my role with that department, I was responsible for assessing adverse events related to the pharmaceutical manufacturing process for active drug substance that were entering into clinical trial as a part of the VA healthcare system. With leaving the VA, I opened the first state-approved testing facility in New Mexico and ran that for several years and worked very closely with the New Mexico Department of Health and helping them understand risk profiles and deficiencies in quality management systems that were leading to public health concerns and adverse events in consumer and patient populations. While I was running the lab, you start failing samples for cultivators and manufacturers, and the first thing that they want to do is point the finger at the laboratory and say, you don't know what you're doing. And so that created a really tremendous opportunity to start educating industry stakeholders on the value of quality management systems and how to begin correlating testing outcomes back to process controls inside of these environments. And so I ended up developing a quality management system based on its Title 21 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 111 for dietary supplements for a cannabis producer in New Mexico. Shortly thereafter, I met Steph Scher, who's the founder of Americans for Safe Access, and she had just started working with the American Herbal Products Association to develop a set of regulatory recommendations for regulators to help members of state legislatures and regulatory officials in state markets to understand risk controls and quality management as applicable to cannabis. From there, I went on to do pretty wide consulting throughout the United States and a little bit abroad. I was trained as an assessor for the ISO 17025 Laboratory Quality Management System standards, and I just kind of started working with governments. So I've worked or volunteered my time, I guess is maybe a better way of putting it, to states like New Mexico, Minnesota. Spent a lot of time working with the Association of Public Health Laboratories for about 4 or 5 years, and have had a lot of conversations with state laboratory directors, had phone calls with folks within the state lab division at Nevada, conversations I think with Alaska, New York, and at one point I sat on an advisory panel with Carmen to Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and their allied public health partners, which included multiple federal agencies. And it's kind of through that mechanism I met a director with the National Research Council of Canada. We were both presenting at a conference a couple of years ago, and Ralph pulled me to the side afterward and said, hey, what do you know about ASTM? And I said, oh, I know a fair amount, but not a lot. And I said, why? And he's like, I'd like to introduce you to some people over there. I think it'd be really important for all of North America and the rest of the world to start getting some brain trust together and explore developing standards for quality management for the cannabis industry. And so I worked with ASTM for several months to help put together a team of leading experts in the cannabis industry to begin discussing formation of the D37 committee. And after we all agreed to form and ASTM approved it, I was elected as vice chairman of the ASTM D37 committee for international standardization of cannabis products.
Recognized for follow-up?
So ASTM, just for people who don't know, is, from my understanding, you can correct me, the international association that tells people how to test stuff.
Yeah.
And the, I guess, top, or what is considered the top organization that tells people all across the globe how to test stuff, asked you to be the chair when they decided to figure out how the whole world should be testing marijuana. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was invited to be the vice chairman. So Ralph Paroli is the chairman of the group, and he's been a mentor of mine around the ASTM process, and has helped me to really learn and understand how ASTM works as an organization. They're definitely globally recognized. They've been around since the late 1800s, and they work very collaboratively and cooperatively with other quality standards groups such as ISO, the International Standards Organization, ANSI, and ASQ. And so there's a lot of cooperation between the various standards groups that are out there.
I have a lot more questions, but I'll yield to members of the
Thank you. We'll move
committee.
on. And Mr. Applin, if you can, you please talk a little closer to the microphone. Yeah, I know
Sorry. I know
it's hard.
I appreciate the prompt. I'm pretty shy.
Hey, you're doing a great job. It's difficult. Representative West, you are recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is to Mr. Applin as well. Thanks for coming and addressing the committee. For me, this is probably the most important part of implementing the state question, is ensuring people get the safe product and, you know, THC levels and all the stuff that comes with that. I think that our biggest obstacles always been, you know, with the state question has been the timeline that came with the state question. Can you give us an idea of how long it took to implement, you know, for these other states, these testing procedures that we're talking about?
Years. Carmen might be able to articulate this a little bit better than I can. You know, it's really how we get to testing. I look at New Mexico, which is where I started my career in cannabis, and when I started my laboratory, it was completely illegal, and it took 4 years for the state to develop regulations around it. And I worked very closely with them in identifying, you know, what a kind of a basic level of laboratory regulation and oversight should look like. That said, when we look at how the industry has evolved nationally or globally, there's a sufficient amount of information out there that can be adopted directly or built upon to facilitate rapid development of laboratory requirements in newer emerging markets like Oklahoma.
For a follow-up?
So do you think with the information that's out there and available already that we could use, is it feasible to have testing procedures in place within the next 6 months?
Oh, absolutely. I think in reviewing the proposed regulations from both the Department of Health and industry in Oklahoma, there's a lot of cohesiveness between the two proposed regulatory sets, and they do a really great job of adopting the strengths in testing programs that we see in other markets. And so I think it's very conceivable.
Okay, thank you.
Leader Copeland, you are recognized for a question.
You're quite knowledgeable about this, obviously, and you're way over my head. But you and others that we've heard testimony from have convinced me that testing is an essential element in implementing this program. Can you tell me how many programs that have, how many states that have implemented programs have done so without testing?
The New Mexico program was started without a mandatory requirement for testing or facilities to support testing. It's only been within the last year or two, or maybe longer. The industry came up first, and then the state started adapting their own internal laboratory to maintain oversight of the testing industry in that state. And talking to Carmen, Arizona is also another program that started without testing or testing requirements. California, I think, started without testing requirements. Yeah.
Follow-up.
For a follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the states that started without a testing program, what were the downfalls? What was the downside to those? Would you kind of elaborate to the committee what you think the problem with not having testing was?
It's a little bit of conjecture, but I suspect in those states that didn't have testing, there were, in all likelihood, a significant number of adverse health events that were happening in the consumer population that went completely unnoticed. And there's little doubt in my mind that individuals have suffered negative consequences of consuming cannabis products that weren't tested, and I suspect that looking into the future, particularly around risks or adverse events associated with pesticide residues, we're not going to see that data come to light for maybe another decade.
For a follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I don't know how familiar you are with the state question we passed in Oklahoma, but if you are familiar to that extent, what would it take to implement a testing program in Oklahoma to coincide with the implementation of 788?
So I'm not an attorney, so I can't speak to the legal elements of it. Carmen might tap me on the shoulder, Carmen, if you have anything to add here. But again, with the regulations, the proposed regulations that I've seen, there are a tremendous amount of strengths in those regulations promulgated by the Department of Health. And I think as a starting point in getting things moving very quickly, it'd be very easy if legal circumstances allow to directly adopt those regulations that were proposed by the Oklahoma Department of Health.
One last follow-up.
For a follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For my last follow-up, there's been some legislation put together and proposed by some of the groups that worked on this issue. Would you say that the urgency of getting that enacted, I mean, how would you rate that? Would you do that as soon as possible, or would you wait months to implement those regulations as far as testing goes? How would you gauge the necessity for doing that?
My personal opinion is that rapid advancement of testing capabilities is extraordinarily important to protecting the interests of the public health for the citizens of Oklahoma. I would do it as quickly as possible. It'll take, I mean, you pass regulations, and then you have individuals that need to fill the need for that, right? So we have to build laboratories. If you're moving quickly, like with my laboratory, which was pretty basic, from the time that I had secured funding to the time that I became operational with getting the equipment set up and then validating methods was 10 months. And so the sooner agreement can be reached around a starting point for laboratory regulations, the sooner that ball will start getting moving, and the sooner you have information that's then available. I want to take a second to segue, and I hope that that's okay. Industry has a tendency to look at quality management and testing provisions as a cost center. It is at the outset, but in the long term, quality management and testing can really drive not only improvement in product quality and mitigate long-term legal liability for negative consumer effects, but can also help people drive process efficiency. And the more efficient you get, the better your margins are. And when we look at markets, you know, more advanced or mature markets around cannabis, what we see is that over time, the amount of commodities that are available in the marketplace go up, and prices drop really, really quickly. And so when you see that supply-demand and price shift happen, what differentiates successful organizations from organizations that are almost assured of terminality to their operations is their ability to drive process improvement and maintain quality.
And I appreciate the other questions. I appreciate Representative West's question. I had the same question that he did. And thank you both for being here. I really appreciate it. It does help this committee to hear what you had to say. I think this is a question for Ms. Hanson regarding, is NCSL monitoring what's going on in Washington as far as cannabis being a Schedule I drug, as far as any legislative changes that maybe are being proposed at that level?
Mr. Chair and Senator, yes, our Federal Affairs Committee in our Washington, D.C. office is staying abreast of what's happening, what's being proposed. We have not seen any discussions that have gone very far with any kind of rescheduling or descheduling at the federal level. There are a few proposals from members of Congress to try to do it through the legislative process, but they haven't really even been heard in committee, to my knowledge. I specialize in states. Our staff in DC specializes on the federal level, but I haven't heard of any real movement on any of the federal discussions within agencies or within Congress itself.
For a follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. We've heard from different presenters throughout this process that those changes on a federal level are right around the corner, so it sounds like you would not agree with that assessment at this point.
Co-Chair and Senator, I believe that it's government in politics, which is always a magic snow bubble or a magic 8-ball as far as I'm concerned. I've seen things have so much momentum and then stall at the last stage. I've seen things stall, and then everything happens in the last 36 hours. So I've been doing this 17 years. This isn't my first rodeo with seeing something take a while or just take off like gangbusters. So I'd be a really poor federal prognosticator probably, but all I can speak to is what we've seen, and we just don't see a lot of current action on the measures moving or the discussions on this. There have been a few, but they're not like happening every day.
For a follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's probably not a fair question, so I apologize for that, but I appreciate your perspective. One more question when it comes to labs. Are any states using existing labs in Oklahoma that may be like the DEQ or Department of Ag, who has labs, but in other states that do have testing, are those tests always done by outside agencies?
Mr. Chair and Senator, I can say a little bit, and I'd like to allow Jeremy to have a bit of a follow-up comment. Okay. To my knowledge, the states will certify those outside labs first, but they aren't necessarily running all of the tests for industry within their states. They're maybe setting the benchmarks and certifying the samples that are used to test the labs, but they themselves are not doing all the testing internally within the state system, if that, I think, is your question, but I'd like Jeremy to fill in.
I agree with Carmen on that being the norm. The one outlier to that I'm aware of is the state of New York. So when they initially brought their program online, it was the state, I think the Department of Public Health, their laboratory, ran all of the samples for a period of time. And then what they did was they used that data to identify like a baseline or a reference analytical method. So when we look at referenceable analytical methods, we're defining how precise, how sensitive, those kind of elements around the methodology. And then they allowed industry to start. And industry is always going to want to innovate and come up with their own approaches. And so by New York having that referenceable method, they said, you have to be as good as or better than us. I think there's one other state. You know where Tina Fan is at? She's in New Jersey. I think New Jersey also, the state laboratories handled the majority or all of the testing for that market as well.
Thank you, Representative Fettgatter. You are recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, if I may have a little bit of leniency, I've received several messages this morning from patients and people who are participating in this industry. And I would just like to let it be known that this committee is not doing anything whatsoever to slow down the process of implementation of the state question, the way it was implemented, or the way it was written, and the way it was voted on by the citizens of the state of Oklahoma. Our goal is to try to build framework around what will it look like in the future. So please keep in mind that if you're having issues with your doctors and others, that it's not us that is slowing that down. If there are municipalities that are doing things that you feel is is contrary to what 788 had written in it, you need to reach out to those municipalities. Our group is not slowing this process down. Now on to my question. My question is dealing with how precise is the testing when it comes to the THC content. You had mentioned some situations where some labeling showed twice as much THC in it. How precise is that in the testing process? And is there a margin of error that we should be considering as we write legislation?
So precision and sensitivity are functions of the method that's going to be deployed, right? And so between methods, it could vary. And that's, I think, probably why New York started out testing inside of their state level lab initially to determine that baseline to say you have to be as good and or better than us. To give an example of kind of like that threshold around it, like the error limits, Minnesota, when they initially passed their regulations, they said you can, if you label this product as 100 milligrams, you can be 10% or 10 milligrams above or 10%, 10 milligrams below, right? And what they found was that the two licensed producers in that market had a very, very, very difficult time staying within that 10% range on either sides of the label mark. And I think that they may have bumped it up a little bit. If I remember correctly from the regulations that were proposed in Oklahoma, it's 15% on either side, 15% above or 15% below. And I think that that is very reasonable for an emerging market. Nobody wants to get shorted, right? But we still have to be mindful of the sophistication of new operators in a new market as they go through their learning. I think we also have to be mindful of, you know, the fact that we're dealing with the plant and there's variability. If we're manufacturing a pharmaceutical or a dietary supplement, we're getting certified ingredients and we can calculate theoretical yield and we can more readily manage our variance around that theoretical yield. And so a little bit of leeway right now I think is fair. And I think that with ongoing monitoring and good communication between industry stakeholders, patients involved in the program, and regulatory officials, determination can be made down the line if that margin needs to constrict a little bit more.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the leniency.
Thank you. So, Mr. Co-Chairman, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you very much. I know both of you were given two different drafts of language to look at that have been proposed here in the state. One was proposed by the State Department of Health, was actually passed and then rolled back when they rolled back a lot of others. Another is from what is being called the Unity Bill, which is written mainly by people in the industry or hoping to be in the industry in Oklahoma. I think I heard you say in response to Representative Copeland's question that you believe a good starting point for us regulation-wise is closer to the health department's bill and not the Unity bill. Did I hear that correctly? Let's start there.
Yes, and to justify a little bit why I think that in some areas the Unity bill starts getting a little bit too specific. When I think about a state like Oklahoma, which is different but not super different from a state like New Mexico where you don't have an overwhelmingly large population, when we start creating provisions for laboratory directors with educational and experiential criteria that would include having an MD, a PhD, or a master's degree, along with a number of years of experience inside of a regulated laboratory environment, it's hard to find those people. Usually those people are pretty embedded where they're at and they're expensive. And so if we think about moving quickly or efficiently with starting laboratories, the verbiage that the Department of Health bill uses around appropriately qualified, I think allows a little bit of some more degrees of freedom in really being able to assess who's a good fit for a laboratory director. Again, and kind of looking at economic consequences or impact of the two separate proposals. One of the things that really stood out to me inside of the Unity bill was a suggestion for validating cultivation or processing methods and then using that validation to reduce the frequency of testing, right? So if we validate our cultivation approach or we validate our manufacturing approach, we test a certain number of runs, and then we say, okay, you passed 4 times in a row, or you're good to go. If I remember correctly, one of the timelines associated with that was 90 days. What I know from my experience of developing and implementing quality management systems is that human nature is to move towards the path of least resistance. I've been in many organizations where we've flagged products for contaminants or other issues. We go in, we develop and implement quality provisions, everybody's excited and they're on board, and testing for the next 90 days is great. And then all of a sudden people start getting lax and lazy, and we start deviating from that, and all of a sudden the failures or other issues that we are able to identify during testing start to creep back in. In addition to that, if we're only testing 1 or 4 times a year, and we have, I don't know, say there's maybe 20 organizations that pop up in Oklahoma that are involved in, I think it'll be far, far more than that. But if we're only testing 4 times a year as an organization, and I'm a laboratory, and I've sunk $1 million into facility and equipment build out, I need to be able to recoup that investment. And I'm not going to be able to do that off of a very small or finite number of samples. And if I can't recoup my investment, then we start to see some of the things that I talked about in my presentation, where you get that economic pressure over the laboratory, and they too are going to start to deviate, and you're going to start seeing potentially funny things crop up that would undermine the integrity of the program in the long run. Did that answer your question?
Thank you, and follow up.
For follow-up?
Yes. So what I heard, your two, I guess, knocks or your two concerns on the Unity bill is A, that labs may have trouble surviving financially with the way it's set up, and also that labs may have trouble finding lab directors, and so they may not get started in the first place. Between the two bills, in what they test, because I think that to me is the first question that you have to answer, is what are we going to test for? Just looking at those two on that subject, are there differences, and if so, where do we go?
If my memory serves me correctly, there was tremendous parity between the two proposed regulatory sets. And I don't think that there's any conflict or issue there.
Follow up.
For follow-up?
And I'm going to ask questions for a long time, so you can tell me to be
No,
quiet
good.
and go to other people and come. I literally have 2 pages worth, so anytime you want to move on. But,
We need to be talking specifics. Keep going.
okay, so you talked about multiple states, and this may be for both of you. Different states have different goals for their marijuana program. You have states that do medical, you have states that do recreational, you have states that do both. State Question 788 is a medical marijuana law. And so my question is, if this is a medical marijuana state, what do we need to be testing for that maybe other states do not? And people last week we had someone talk about terpene, is that right? So can you talk a little bit about if this is medicine, are there things that we may need to do that maybe even other states are not doing so that we have the best medical marijuana system in the United States?
So when we write regulations that are intended to protect the interest of public safety, we always look towards the most vulnerable population and use that as a benchmark. I don't know in that context that the requirements for a medical commodity would be any different than a recreational commodity, because we would make the assumption that somebody who is seeking a therapeutic agent for a medical issue may also be a consumer in the recreational market, right? So product safety is product safety. To comment on the terpene statement that you made, terpenes definitely impact the way that we experience cannabis consumption. You can go to any food flavoring supply house in the country and buy things like myrcene, right? So myrcene is a common terpene in cannabis. And if you take that myrcene that you bought from a food flavoring house and you dilute that out and you drink it, you're gonna get a little dizzy, a little tired, and a little hungry, right? And so there's overlapping effect. That overlapping effect has value to people, maybe, in interpreting or in trying to anticipate the effects that they might experience from a given cannabis product. That said, if we compare it to medicine, we disclose actives, but we don't ask the consumer population to interpolate the effect that they're going to experience, right? We give people a list of potential adverse events, and we give them a list of potential therapeutic benefit that we hope that we see. In deviating from what other states are doing, there's nothing that really stands out to me as a unique requirement for testing. I think that where differentiation can occur is really around the details of how those tests are performed. When I say details, I'm referencing things like sensitivity, specificity for methods, things like microbial thresholds or action levels for pesticides. And I think that after having contact with folks within your state lab division in your Department of Health, the state of Oklahoma is no more, like, you guys have an amazing knowledge set around you, and to really work inside of your professional community and the expertise that exists here, and support your state regulatory officials in being involved with organizations like the Association of Public Health Laboratories, ISO or ASTM, really gives those folks access to a broader national and global community to exchange ideas. And that's also where we're going to grow and improve public safety, not only for the citizens of Oklahoma, but also on a global basis.
One more follow-up, and then I will have a couple more ask some questions.
That's great, thank you. And I'll follow up just specifically on that, I guess. From a lab side, I'm not asking you to comment as a medical doctor because you're not. But from a laboratory side, are we at a place with marijuana or cannabis where there may be a type that is better for my PTSD as opposed to a type that is better for my chronic pain? And if so, the standards that you have seen, does one of them handle that better than the other, or do either of them handle that level of specificity?
I have not seen, nothing stands out from the two proposed sets of regulations in my memory about kind of leaning one way or the other with that. To speak a little bit more broadly in terms of therapeutic effect of cannabis or cannabis constituents as therapeutic agents, we are in the infancy of our understanding of the endocannabinoid system. This is a very complex system that's not dissimilar from the cardiovascular system or the nervous system or the immune system, right? But we've only discovered it in the 1990s, and we're still learning a lot. And I think that it would be a disservice to you to answer your question by saying yes or no, because I think in some circumstances, maybe yes, and in other circumstances, maybe no. But empowering patient populations to self-titrate and explore does two things. One, it gets people actively involved in their care, which is something that mainstream medicine has really been striving for a long time. We know that when somebody who's suffering from a chronic health condition or even an acute health condition has control over their treatment or input around their treatment, the outcomes tend to be much more positive. And if we can ensure the safety of the commodity and empower people to have a role in healing themselves or alleviating symptoms themselves and give them that power and control, I think that we can have faith that the outcomes will be positive. Worst anecdotal story here. When I first came into the cannabis industry, I was adamant that cannabis should be treated like any other pharmaceutical. And if we're going to make therapeutic claims, those claims should be validated through robust clinical trials. My mind changed when I was at a medical advisory board hearing in New Mexico, and a little girl that was probably 11 years old got up in front of 350 people to address a 12-member medical advisory board of doctors. And she got up and the first words out of her mouth were, "Thank you for giving me back my dad. Please don't take his medicine away from him." And her story went on to say, my dad was hurt at work and he was taking these pills that his doctor had given him, and he stayed on the couch for 3 years. Once he got access to this medical cannabis program, he got off the couch and he went back to work. And she said, now every day my dad comes home from work and he plays with me and my younger brother. Sometimes when we look at health outcomes, it's not solely around therapeutic effect or benefit that's quantifiable. There's also a huge factor of quality of life improvement. So again, in terms of therapeutic indices and what a patient or consumer experiences, if it doesn't cure their disease, that's fine. If they experience benefit from it and it improves their quality of life and helps them better engage with their children or other loved ones around them, that's a really amazing opportunity to give somebody.
Thank you, and I will come back to you. Representative Bush, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here. I just got back from Phoenix, Tempe area, where I met with some of their city officials and county officials on how they implemented their medical marijuana program. It was very impressive. So, Ms. Hansen, this may be a question more for you and NCSL. I'm from Tulsa, and those folks are trying to set some of their requirements and regulations around dispensaries and grows in the Tulsa area. Does NCSL have best practices with cities and counties that you can share with us via email or something? Do you all drill down that low on that?
Mr. Chair and Representative Bush, NCSL tracks, we are the experts for state level legislation. However, I'm happy to look into some kind of best practices for localities and find that, but it will not be NCSL's material, but I'm happy to look into other local organizations. Every level of government has been involved in these processes in each state that has a medical program because there are both state and local level licensing involved, so everyone's got a role to play. I'm happy to look into maybe the National Association of Cities and Counties and or other municipal leagues that have, and the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials too. They have some databases for other levels of government regulations and things like that. I'm happy to look some up for locations and licensing requirements for dispensaries. Are you looking for like physical or more like other components like security and staffing and
Yes.
kind of everything? Okay.
Yes, that would be great. For follow-up, I'm sorry.
Yeah, for follow-up?
Yeah, I know that there are some, a couple of cities in my county that are already starting to put some of their procedures together, and I just would like, I think it's important that we look at that to make sure they don't overstep their bounds, which is a little bit different than the testing question, but since you brought that up on one of your slides, I thought I would ask. And I have one more question.
For follow-up?
I think this has to do with Mr. Applin. I was trying to take notes, very detailed, learned a lot for somebody who never took chemistry, so thank you. I think you said that the cost of the testing from the labs, was that put back on to, who pays for the testing?
So testing is paid by the organization that's submitting the material to be tested. What you might be thinking about is the comment that I made in terms of paying for the validation of methods, right? So if a lot of cannabis laboratories absorb that cost, if I'm a food laboratory or a laboratory that's serving the food industry, and I have a food manufacturer come to me that needs to meet a federal requirement, they bring me their product and they bring me a list of ingredients, and I as the lab would charge that organization to validate the method to be able to test their product. I might change that if there's a commitment for a certain volume of samples that would be coming through, so I know how quickly I can recoup that cost. But again, validating methods, it's not uncommon for that to take weeks, and have a dedicated member of the staff overseeing and performing that validation operation. So it can be very costly. Is that helpful?
So, for follow-up?
For follow-up?
So the cost goes back to the organization that's submitting the sample?
Yes.
Okay, so is there an average of what that is on the cost to do? I mean, I understand it's a business, so it's a cost to do business, and they've got to absorb that cost. So what is the average percentage that testing would cost that organization?
That I don't know. Just to kind of toss a number out there, in regulated industries, operators in those regulated industries should anticipate that their overall quality management program should amount to, if I remember correctly, it's around 3% of their annual revenue.
Thank you.
Chair just has a couple quick questions. When I was analyzing the Department of Health regs, it appeared to me that they were almost word for word California's regulations. Am I right on that, or am I wrong?
I don't know about word for word, but there's a lot of similarities.
How are they different?
I don't recall. To kind of elaborate a little bit though, when it's been a couple months since I've looked at, I think the new emergency regulations for California came out in maybe July, and then they had pre-approval, and they'll be finalized later this year. When I looked at those regulations, what I saw was a lot of continuity with existing food laws and a lot of continuity with the Food Safety Modernization Act and elements of, I think it's 21 CFR 117. And that's a very good thing.
Okay, yeah. Well, and on the California side, so a follow-up for that, and I couldn't find the differences too. Maybe they're there, but I don't have your training. I just know when I looked, I couldn't find them. So I did some research on, and again, I don't have your training, but kind of the reaction to California's testing requirements, and I didn't find very much good things. For the most part, it looked like it led to some pretty extreme delays. So why, my concern in this, and then I can go into a couple specifics where I think the delays would come in. I'm nervous to adopt California regulations to the oldest medical marijuana market in the nation, to immediately put those on the newest makes me a little nervous. And the fact that they appear to be more stringent, frankly, than every other state in the nation. So I guess a twofold question: are they in fact more stringent than every other state in the nation? And what would be the effect of doing the most stringent laws on a brand new program from the patient's perspective?
I don't know that they're the most stringent in the nation. Connecticut and Minnesota both have some pretty robust quality requirements in their markets. In terms of starting out with kind of a high bar for Oklahoma, honestly, it's a good thing. When we look at, I'm going to build a laboratory, or I'm going to build a cultivation facility, or I'm going to start doing processing, if the quality bar is extremely low, what it sets me up for down the road is a tremendous amount of expense. Backwardly integrating quality management systems is more difficult than doing it on the first pass, because you already have established cultural elements within inside of the organization and established expectations. And so now you end up spending a whole bunch of time trying to retrain your staff. And if we have, say, let me think of it. I'm going to go to micro because it's pretty clean and easy. So microbes are everywhere in our environment, right? Mold is everywhere in our environment. So if I'm building a facility today and I don't have to test for mold, am I going to bear that in mind when I'm constructing that facility? No, I'm not, most likely, right? Because starting a business takes a huge capital investment, and the goal of a business is to get to break even and then get to revenue. So you want to minimize your expenditure on the upfront and then grow over time until you become profitable. If I know that I'm going to encounter something that could inhibit or impact my ability to bring product to market, such as micro testing, then I'm going to account for that when I'm building my facility. And this saves me the problem of 2 or 3 years from now having a state be like, oops, you know, we decided that we're going to raise the bar now, and me looking at my facility and saying, holy buckets, I spent $500,000 to build this thing, and I'm not in a good spot because I didn't think about process flow through my environment. And now what do I need to do? I'll give you an example of this. I worked with a manufacturer where the state had come, inspected their facility, and said, okay, over here you're doing extractions. You need to put in a fixed plumbing hand washing sink. And so the organization went and got a quote, and what they heard back from the plumber was, okay, we're going to have to jackhammer out about 30, 40 feet of concrete flooring in your business, and we're going to have to run piping and conduit and all this stuff through there, and you're going to have to shut down all of your operations for 3 weeks. So in that 3-week period, you have a company that's losing shelf space, they're shutting down operations, they're not making money, and they're laying off 20 employees to put in a hard-plumbed hand washing sink. And that's the kind of impact that not having awareness of, you know, regulation or risk, or states suddenly deciding on a dime that they want to change things, can have for a small business.
Thank you. And my last follow-up, and I'm glad you brought up micro-testing, because I totally agree, but my understanding is micro-testing is in both proposals that are being considered. I was specifically going into the California type regulations, and one of my understandings to go and so like micro-testing, which I agree, I mean, that's not even on the table whether or not we're going to do it, but on the California type Department of Health regs, one of the things is my understanding, and you got to help me because I'm not a chemist, that it requires testing for about 50 different heavy metals as opposed to the standard throughout the nation, which is closer to 6 with the high end of 10, with the exception of California. Number one, am I wrong, because I may be, as to what the standards are? And number two, my understanding is that's a large portion of the cost driver that will get passed along.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how many metals California is requiring, but I will say this about California. You have to look at the history of the state, right? So they had mining happening there for a very, very long time. And when you're mining for gold, this is stepping out of my domain, if I remember correctly, mercury used to be used a lot in separating gold from ore, and I'm sure that there are other metals that were as well. In New Mexico, where I live, we had a discussion at one point where there's been a lot of uranium mining, right? And then you have Los Alamos National Laboratories and White Sands Missile Range, where you have decades of nuclear experiments and controlled nuclear explosions, right? Then you look at the capacity for cannabis to act as a bioaccumulator of heavy metals. There may be circumstances in California that require them to move towards a broader panel of heavy metal analysis that wouldn't necessarily be required in Oklahoma, and that could be broken out potentially too by region. And so I'm trying to, like years ago I did a paper on selenium migration from mining in Montana, right? So air can carry things, and you know, if you talk to your environmental division at the state, they should be able to provide insight into what the risk potentials are for heavy metal exposures and outdoor grows.
So I said that was my last one, but actually this one really is my last one. Move on. I need to stop saying that because who knows. So it is safe to say that if there was, which I think there is, but we'll have to go back and look, if the Department of Health regulations requires California type heavy metal testing, you're not suggesting that's what's needed in Oklahoma. To my knowledge, we don't have, you know.
I'm not suggesting that at all. I think, to go back to an earlier statement that I made, you guys have an amazing brain trust within your departments, and these folks are experts into public health and environmental risks and concerns for citizens of Oklahoma, and leveraging them to the fullest extent possible to get their insight and get that knowledge transfer between different state divisions, I think will get, and then working with industry inside of that capacity too, to understand how, you know, potential industry stakeholders or consumers are viewing these things or what they're concerned about, and really driving that dialogue between all of the stakeholders is a really great start. And one more kudos to the state of Oklahoma. When I was here a couple of weeks ago talking to the processing committee, I was really blown away by the level of support that Oklahoma offers its citizens in food processing through its agricultural extension offices and cooperatives. And I think that when we talk about all of the fears associated with quality control and regulatory oversight of this emerging industry, the fact that your cooperative extension offices are sitting at the table from day one and interested in offering and providing guidance and support is, I've never seen that in a market before. And in talking to the regulators who will be responsible for overseeing these programs, there's an absolute commitment to working with industry as opposed to working against it or enforcing regulations with a bat. And I think that you as the state of Oklahoma should be very, very proud of that. And I think that industry stakeholders, potential industry stakeholders and consumers, if you can figure out a way to help communicate that out to those populations, I think that everyone will be very impressed with what you guys are doing.
Thank you. Leader Copeland, you're recognized for question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for that endorsement of our extension offices. We need to give them more money, more funding in the future, because they're kind of wilting on the vine. But the issue of testing, we've decided we have to need testing. We know there need to be standards. We keep talking about an independent industry or firm coming in and do the testing and the cost of that. I want you to talk a little bit. And one of the problems with that is we don't have a licensing procedure in place for that to come in. But I want you to talk a little bit more about the states that have state-sponsored testing and where we don't have to reinvent the wheel to get this off the ground and moving, where we have testing facilities available now that are state-owned that could be utilized in the interim to implement 788. Can you go into that, Annie?
So I'll kick it off and then I'm going to suddenly pass the ball to Carmen. For state laboratories to take on the responsibility of testing medical cannabis, there's a whole bunch of red tape inside of that, right? So most state laboratories receive some amount of federal funding, and that federal funding has contingencies around it. And so if I'm a forensic laboratory that's testing marijuana for law enforcement, that's one thing. It's a whole nother ball of wax to be testing cannabis that's coming out of a state-endorsed medical program. And I have zero insight into how states like New York or New Jersey were capable of working through that red tape so that they were able to support their industries or emerging industries without coming into conflict with federal funding sources or federal regulations. And Carmen, I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic over to you to see if you have anything to add to that.
Mr. Chair and Leader Copel, I could ask New Jersey and New York lab directors on your behalf to get some information on how they made that work. If that's something that you're interested in, I can go ahead and reach out to them and get more nuts and bolts on that, because it wasn't necessarily done with a lot of legislative involvement necessarily. It may have just said, hey, like they're going to figure this out and the labs are going to do something, but I'm not familiar with that level of implementation in those two particular states, other than that they initially did do a lot of the testing to start with. But I'm happy to look into that and get some information back to you.
Mr. Co-Chairman, you are recognized for a question.
Thank you. I want to go back where my co-chair left off on heavy metals. Country music guy, not really a heavy metal guy, but hey. Because I had the same concerns walking in today that he had. One of the things that I've been told is that the State Department of Health's regulations go overboard on heavy metal testing. Then one of the things you said in your slides was, and tell me if I've got this wrong, but states that have outdoor grow, or I guess any outdoor grow, is going to have a much higher risk for heavy metal in the marijuana. So if that is true, then as a state that does allow outdoor grow, do we need to have more heavy metal testing than some of these other states that do not allow outdoor grow?
I think that's really a conversation that should be taken up with your environmental department or your Department of Agriculture. If there is an endemic heavy metal concern in the soil in the state of Oklahoma, I'm assuming that there will be other agricultural commodities that are sensitive to this as well. And so geological surveys might have insight to that. I'm not an expert in this area. And again, I would leverage the folks around you within various state departments to identify what's in the soil here. What is the geological makeup in the substrates?
All right. Thank you. Follow-up?
For follow-up?
So going back again to your presentation, and I'm going to be all over the place because I'm just basically walking through your presentation at this point, and the things that I didn't understand, and there are a lot. So you talked about most states test buds, but basically what you said is that once things are processed and put into a cookie, a brownie, something like that, the testing is typically not there. Is that a fair statement?
It's market by market. And The reason that some states don't require that is too much of a burden on industry, right? So again, we have to validate the method for each matrix that's undergoing testing. So Carmen might have a gummy that she makes one way and I might make it completely different, but because all of the ingredients are unique between those two products, or even a single ingredient may be different between those two products, I have two unique matrices, and therefore I need to validate the methods for that product to ensure that the results that I'm generating are accurate. It's time and cost. So we've seen some states say, okay, we're not going to tackle this right now because it's too complex. From the state regulatory side, if you're going to require people to validate all of these methods, somebody's got to be looking over that too. And so it gets pretty complicated and can get very expensive.
So if I'm making brownies and my co-chair is making cookies, it would actually be, well, not completely, but largely different testing methods that you might use for my brownies as opposed to his cookies.
It could be completely different methods. They could be the same method. It doesn't matter. If I want to use the same method, I have to prove that it works, right? And so anytime we get a unique commodity in and we say, okay, we're going to test this thing, before we can report the data with confidence, we have to prove that the method is accurate for that commodity or that matrix.
And when you say commodity, you mean a specific, so if we're both making cookies, it could still be totally different.
Yes, it could.
Just for two different sets of cookie recipes.
Yes, maybe he uses glycerin as a sweetener and you're using sugar. And is that glycerin or is the sugar interfering with the resolution, the sensitivity, or the specificity of the analytical method?
Okay. Just hurt my poor little brain. All right, so moving into, you talked quite a bit about as ways to game the system of testing.
Yes.
And the ability of me as a grower to give you samples that are going to come back with the results that I want, even if I know that may not be the result of, you know, the whole batch. How, and this Carmen may help too, I don't know, how have other states tried to beat that game?
In all honesty, I've talked about this issue a fair amount, and in more cases than not, states, the regulatory response has been, oh, we didn't know that. There's a lot of learning opportunity, and that again goes back to, if I'm a field agent and I'm in somebody's operation and I'm reviewing technical data, so I'm looking at their product specifications and their documented procedures, and then I'm looking at test results, having the ability to pick up a phone and call somebody in the analytical division or actually be on site with somebody from the analytical division, especially in the early years, becomes really powerful. And then it's also having the, I'm going to call it the Oklahoma approach in this context, where your regulatory agencies don't seem to be wanting to put the fear of God into industry. And once you remove that do or die kind of a relationship, you open the transfer of knowledge between industry stakeholders and the regulatory community. There's no reason for them to hide. If I fail a test result and I call up my regulator, my case officer, and I say, hey, I just failed a micro test and I don't know what to do, and that individual isn't telling me you got to destroy it all and, you know, figure it out or you're going to go out of business, and instead says to me, oh, well, let's talk through it and let's see if we can identify it, because the state's going to learn that information can be widely distributed. It sets everybody up for success. There's no reason to hide inside of that. And that's something that, you know, I've seen state and municipal regulators struggle with this concept, but it's a directive that FDA is undertaking. And FDA's modern operational goals, one of the things that they're really trying to do is get better at working with industry and regulate through partnership as opposed to regulate through punishment. It's just much, much more effective.
For follow-up?
So you started with this idea that testing is the final verification. And this basic concept is that if you're growing cannabis, you should, if you know what you're doing, know what your product is before it ever gets to the laboratory. You can correct me if I'm misstating that, but my question in that is, knowing that we have seen a whole lot more people apply to grow cannabis in Oklahoma than I think anyone expected, and I think most people believe more than we would ever need. Do you see a risk for our state right now with what's happening that we're going to have a lot of people growing who don't know what they're growing and thus maybe even a higher need for lab testing than a lot of the other states had when they started out?
I think what we see ubiquitously on the cultivation side is when you have a pathway to being able to legally grow, you have a whole bunch of closet growers start coming out, right? So it's everybody who's had their little home grow or tucked out in the woods somewhere, like they want to get legit. Just like in any other industry, there's challenges to scaling up, right? So if I'm used to maintaining an illicit grow of 20, 40, 50 plants, and now I want to grow 1,000 plants, it's a completely different ballgame. We can set goals, specifications, right? We buy seeds, and the seed packet might come with this plant of this genetics of this plant should generate X amount of THC and Y amount of CBD. It's not always a one-to-one. What we're doing with quality management is trying to drive consistency, but another layer of that is really knowing what we do. You sit with a lot of folks and you say, how do you do this? And they'll walk you through it, tell you, and then you watch them do it. They're not doing what they just told you they did, right? And it's not even a conscious thing. It's just purely human behavioral nature. So the goal with quality management is to ultimately help people see, document what it is that they think that they're doing, help pull them in line with what they're, pull that in line with what they're actually doing, and then maintain data around it so that they can see if a deviation occurs, how it impacted the outcome of it. Testing, right? So testing is that measurement at the end. And we can use that data to go back and evaluate our processes, our policies, our procedures, and see if they're really helping us to get to where we want to be. In terms of having a difference in terms of need around testing, you'll never know what you're doing if you don't measure it. It's just kind of a de facto need. Like, if I want to be good at what I'm doing, I need to understand what I'm doing and how I'm doing it, and then I need to measure the variables around that to see if I'm hitting the targets that I want to hit. It's completely okay if I'm not, in some circumstances, right? In not meeting my targets, what it creates is an opportunity to grow and learn and improve. And one thing I'll say with absolute certitude about every cultivator that I've ever met, whether they're legit or they're illegal, those guys and gals want to be the best that they can be. They really do. And they're passionate about it. And I think it's unfortunate in some ways that you have this long-standing kind of illicit and controversial industry and product that when people look at being regulated, they look at, you know, particularly around quality, they say, oh, the man is trying to put his weight on me. Really what the man or regulation is trying to do is help these people evolve and really give them a well-established structure or architecture to get to where they really want to be. They just don't know how to work inside of the system again. And not to harp too much on your agricultural extension offices, those people are fantastic. And the tools in this state exist to really help people learn and understand and to be successful and be the quality of grower or processor that they envision themselves as being. Sometimes it's really hard to have that mirror held up in front of you and seeing your deficiencies, but with the right support around you, you can get over that and you can grow and get past it.
Thank you.
Representative Fettgetter, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I really do want to echo Leader Copeland's words. And you're welcome to talk about how great the extension offices are all day long. And he's right, we do need more funding. If we'd have passed the step-up plan, we would have had a little bit more money we could have put there. But with that being said, Oklahoma being a great ag state with the use of herbicides and pesticides, do you have concerns with outdoor commercial grow?
Overspray.
Sorry?
Overspray. That's my one-word answer. If you've got an outdoor cannabis grow,
Yes.
I ran into this situation up in Washington where large, highly respected producer built a greenhouse that had open vents on it, and they were near an apple orchard, and the apple orchard applied using crop dusters a couple times a year, and it drifts, right? And so how you address that, I'm not 100% sure. Be good to your neighbors and talk to them a bunch.
Yeah. So there is some concern with overspray.
Absolutely.
Thank
yeah.
you.
Representative West, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is there any record of any other states that have had a spread of contamination or disease other than California?
In terms of like spreading of disease, are you talking like a plant disease?
Yeah, or you talked about contamination or people getting sick from potential product that wasn't tested properly or.
Okay. So yeah, we've seen like in terms of like contaminants, the one case report that really stands out in my mind actually came from Israel, and it was a immunocompromised individual who had smoked cannabis that was contaminated with Aspergillus niger and then mixed it with tobacco and came down with a case of invasive aspergillosis. Interesting thing about presentation of invasive aspergillosis is that in diagnostic it looks a lot like pneumonia. And so this individual was treated with antibiotics because they had thought that he had pneumonia, and it wasn't until he started to crash that they did a bronchial lavage and figured out that it was in fact a fungal infection, and by the time they started treating him with antifungal medications, it was too late and he crashed and ultimately expired. The big problem with understanding how contaminants impact public health outcomes is that nobody's really doing a good job in tracking that information or collecting that information from the outset. So if our healthcare providers aren't trained to ask, if there's not a centralized repository for holding that information and applying statistical analysis to it, if our regulatory officials aren't trained not to demand a name and to hang up on people when they don't get all the information that they want, we're missing these opportunities. Colorado, I think, is, from what I know, probably the leader in trying to figure this out. So they're working, I think, Carmen, do they have an established cannabis reporting line? They're also working with poison control centers and first-line responders, so like emergency room staff to help them understand how to ask questions, where to report it to, and starting to try to track this. And as that data sets gets larger, we'll have better visibility into it. There's also some, like I worked with an Israeli group earlier this year that was trying to develop like an online tool for self-reporting that could be deployed globally so that patients or consumers could say, hey, I used this strain, or I consumed this strain or this product with this terpene and cannabinoid profile, and I had this outcome, be it positive or negative. And so there are some private or industry-based efforts to begin collecting this data. I think that there's a lot of curiosity and interest from the private sector in how they can work with the public sector. And I think that this is one of those areas where there is a tremendous opportunity for forward-thinking individuals or groups of individuals to really make a dent or leave a robust mark on the landscape of cannabis as a therapeutic agent.
Thank you. I do have a couple quick questions. On the Department of Health regs, I noticed it starts off in the testing section requiring the laboratories to be ANSI, certified ANSI. We had a lot of acronyms. ANSI, as I understand it, is the American version of the ISO. If we were to adopt that, would that result in a 6-month to 12-month delay in implementation of 788?
I don't think so. The reason I don't think so is because if I'm starting a laboratory and I know that I need to meet a quality management standard in order to operate, I'm going to be sourcing equipment. I need to figure out what I need. It's all basic business plan stuff to a certain point. And then it's building out that documentation beyond it. I don't know so much about the ANSI ASQ requirements. With 17025, ideally a laboratory has been operational for at least a couple of years before you go in and do the assessment. I think that I know that there's wiggle room around that with cannabis laboratories because states are requiring, some states require 17025 accreditation before a laboratory can start receiving samples. So it's a document review and looking for gaps in the existing documentation and then maybe coming back a year later or 6 months later to look at and see, is the documentation being followed? Are the appropriate records being kept? And continue down that accreditation process or validation of the accreditation.
So I just want to make sure we're on the same page because, like I said, I'm not an expert, but as Representative Fettgetter said, I am real cognizant of not doing anything that delays implementation of 788. So what I looked at in the Department of Health regs is subsection 310, because there are people following online, 310-681-8-1A, which specifically, and I'll tell you what it says.
Okay.
It specifically requires ANSI certification for any lab to be in existence, and it specifically says accreditation. So then I went to the ANSI website, which specifically says before you will be accredited, it is a 6-month, the average is 12 months, according to their information. The average is 12 months. It says some labs get accredited within 6 months. Now, I've owned a JACO certified accredited staffing agency before. That didn't happen in a week or two. I mean, we're talking about a 6-month to 12-month process. So my concern, and I just want to make sure we're on the same page, that this committee, if they were to adopt the health department regulations without taking that, it looks like pretty clearly that is a vote to delay implementation for 6 months to 12 months based upon ANSI's own words. But you could do something similar by simply saying you must follow ANSI protocols and be certified within 12 months. And then we would have both the protocols you're talking about still be able to implement 788, but have path towards testing standards. What would you, in your expert opinion, think about kind of my compromise idea?
I think it's a great idea. Provisional licensure is active everywhere. Awesome. I would also go back, I would suggest maybe going back to the Department of Health and asking them for clarification around why they suggested ANSI, ASQ, and then try to tease out what their intention is in that and what their thoughts and concerns are, maybe related to provisional licensing.
That makes perfect sense. I don't have any other questions. If any other member of the committee does. I want to say thank you both for coming. I mean, this committee's not easy for everybody. There's a large group here. We ask really hard questions, and because it's a topic we're very confused about. You've been extremely helpful, and we're thankful for your time to come here. And with that, we will, unless my co-chair has anything, we will have our next meeting at 9 a.m. on Wednesday, and the agenda will be forthcoming, and thank you so much.
Thank you.